Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-hosts, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and community organizer and socialist Kenny Cepeda. Today we will be discussing what to make of the USA's $2 trillion stimulus package, or as some have called it, the coronavirus bailout. However, before we get started, I just want to remind folks that we are online at what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find this and any additional information on the episode notes. So please, if everyone can just rate, review, and subscribe wherever you found this podcast, it would do us a tremendous help. Did you want to say something, Andy?
Yeah, I just wanted to note, if people who've watched this show might notice that Eduardo changed the intro a little bit, and we did this after our last episode where, as a result, that episode was watched by a lot of people, but also I was contacted by teachers in Albuquerque who were trying to do a similar organizing around distance learning and trying to put the brakes on it. And Eduardo really reminded me that one of the reasons we're doing this is to kind of send those messages out with the hope that other organizers will see an opportunity to contact us to say, hey, we like what you're doing, or we're interested in that. And so Eduardo thought we should change the introduction a little bit, just to remind people we're trying to do something here. We're not just trying to figure stuff out, which we are, and trying to give people a framework for how to discuss some of these things maybe, and think about these things, but also we're all trying to organize. So I thought it was a good change, so we're going to make that change from now on.
All right, cool. So again, you can contact us directly on our blog. Right, on to our topic then. So, Kenny and Andy, this is the largest stimulus bill in U.S. modern history that the Senate has passed on the 25th of March. It has shown finally that Congress is grasping the economic moment here. And this is an 880-page Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which was passed by 96 votes to 0, and it amounts to the biggest fiscal stimulus, like I said, in modern U.S. history. And it's supposed to be used for hospital aid, direct spending for the constituency, and it's supposed to go into effect straight away, and almost all of the money would be rolled out in the next few months. There's supposed to be in their money $1,200 for people that are making under $75,000, and for children, if you've got kids, $500 for each. And there's even now in this stimulus package, part of it as well, there is some of it that is going to be extended to gig workers, which is the first time now that we are, into the tech world, and people are now getting jobs as part of the gig economy. So that is what we are going to be discussing, and I'd like, maybe any of you can share your thoughts from there.
I guess I want to start with something I saw online. Because obviously the stimulus package is being celebrated as this, tough compromise between the Republicans and Democrats. And it's got something for big business, it's got something for small business, it's got something for working people. And it all seems to be kind of equal, like 500 billion, 500 billion. But hidden within the 425 billion that's supposed to go to the Federal Reserve is just a down payment on $4.25 trillion that's going to big business. And that really is the hidden story about this. And I saw this thing on Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore is like an anti-establishment, liberal, lefty, who's very unhappy with the Democratic Party. Obviously, he doesn't consider himself a Republican. Kind of a Bernie Sanders supporter, but sometimes is critical of that. And on the show, he had this dude called Dylan Ratigan, who is he's a businessman, executive director of Bloomberg. And he basically is a rich guy who's going to talk about what this stimulus is about.
They are actively restructuring the American economy in a way that simply consolidates ownership of assets to a smaller and smaller group in the private sector, using each catastrophe as an opportunity to use taxpayer money to accomplish that. and then they call it a bailout for the people.
Yeah, yeah.
Because imagine, again, if I bankrupt everybody in Los Angeles, but only give a small group of people that are politically connected a bunch of money to go buy all the assets afterwards, who do you think is going to own all the businesses in Los Angeles a year from now?
They're just extracting wealth.
That's right. Not only that, they're just getting free money from the taxpayer to go to buy distressed assets from Americans at a time when the assets are distressed because of the biological catastrophe. So basically, because you have a lot of people that are in distress from the catastrophe, it's a great opportunity to rapaciously strip them of all their assets and make them your tenant and take away all their ownership. But the only way you can do that is if you have money. And so the only place you can really get money is from the government. And so you get these big companies that get the money from the government, so that the big financial institutions get the money from the government, so that they can then just raid all the assets and take complete ownership of everything.
And so you don't think the American...
And then Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer call it a bailout, and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren say, looks good to me.
So we've been betrayed by our entire political class, including our pretend heroes of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders.
Unequivocally.
I don't even know. I don't even want to do the rest of the show.
Oh man, it's going to be great, Jimmy. I don't mean to be. I don't want to take you to a dark place. Just because the American government is corrupt doesn't mean that Americans or the world is doomed. Every government in the world is corrupt. It's just that the American government is similarly corrupt or uniquely corrupt in its own way, but there is no more merit in the American government than really any other government in the world. And that's a little bit heartbreaking for people who want to believe that it's a different place than that. But it's not. So.
Okay. Dylan Radigan.
Now I feel like you're never going to have me back.
Ha! Well, the problem is that this is because they're taking advantage of this biological crisis, and we also can't protest because of this biological crisis, nor will we probably be able to protest for another year until there's a goddamn vaccine.
Pretty brilliant on their part, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Did you say the guest's name? I'm sorry, I missed it.
Dylan Radigan.
Radigan. And that was the guest?
Yeah.
Or, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah.
I feel like we can talk about these bailout without 2008. Because already they even used some of the game plan that they used in 2008.
Yep.
And the one fact that came out of 2008 hasn't ended for many people, for many families who lost their homes. There were millions of people because of the subprime mortgage, predatory lending. These phrases were very much ingrained in our minds. But what came out of that was companies like BlackRock becoming the biggest landlords in the world with properties. This guy Radigan talks about distressed assets. He's talking about these things. People that can't hold on to the investments that they've made, and so they take over. McDonald's is another one. McDonald's don't think of McDonald's as a being in the food business. They're in the real estate business.
Yeah.
He bought about $30 billion, of real estate at that time. And that's another thing that has changed, in our economic system, that the real estate industry has taken over, sorry.
And that's what was meant by everyone losing their houses. Like when we talk about people losing their houses, it was to people like that.
Foreclosures.
Yeah. And so, this is nothing new. The size is bigger, and they it reminds me of a friend who's an artist, and she made this whole art exhibit, and she called it In the Name Of. And they make this, they put in this, whatever bailout or CARE, right, act. It's supposed to be in the name of workers. It's supposed to be in the name of the people. But in reality, we're getting the crumbs of that, and the real money is going up to financial institutions, banks. There's been two pieces to this bailout. The $2 trillion that they pass, and where it includes payments to people, But before that, they had passed about $2 trillion to bail out the banking institution.
Yes, and that's been ongoing up to $1 trillion a day.
Yeah. Well, that is, yeah, they allowed banks to have liquidity on daily transactions up to $1 trillion. So basically, it's unlimited money that they have on a daily basis.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a lot of technical stuff. You know, like the Federal Reserve basically printing money or creating value out of nothing.
Right.
You know, Nixon in the whatever when he was president, he took us off the gold standard. You know, which was the agreement that the world agreed upon. You know, to back the dollar. And currencies were pegged to the dollar, but we no longer had gold reserves. So a lot of this money is fictitious. It's purely based on of faith, you know. And I think this is going to be challenging in this new world that is coming together. But I don't know if you want to comment on this video.
Yeah, I think what some people are saying is that the 2008 recession was really caused by the big businesses basically playing lottery, right? Gambling with our money. And now they are asking once again that their businesses be bailed out during this time because they feel as if this coronavirus pandemic has really hurt their business, especially airlines, and the tourist industry and banks. But I think what sometimes is unknown, or I was looking into, is that they have so massive stocks that they had prior to this pandemic that they had already been trying to do similarly to what was done in 2008, which is again being playing out with our money and playing around with stocks. And this is why they don't really, they're using, as Kenny is pointing out, they're using this excuse as tons of people are being laid off of work in the airline industry, or small businesses are being as well as bankrupt. And I think I think what my concern is about the oversight. And even if there is oversight, which I heard there's trying to be oversight, is that the oversight is still going to be managed by people who are going to have ties and lobbyists that are connected to the big businesses. And so even if now we have oversight, which corporate Democrats have called for, it's still going to be in the hands of big businesses, because this country the government is too corrupt, and Trump is not going to allow anyone to have an independent oversight to be able to manage and control the funds that are being allocated to these big businesses.
But I would say, obviously, it's beyond Trump. You know, one thing to point out is that the Federal Reserve is basically regulated, and there's oversight. Bankers, regulate themselves basically. So that's the Federal Reserve. You know, it is sold as a government institution, but it's bankers regulating themselves. And so they're giving themselves money now.
Yeah, and I want to point out that the oversight committee that they reformed here is the same oversight committee that was done for the last TARP loan, which the last TARP loan was about $800 billion. Last TARP amount was an $800 billion stimulus. And that committee never had the ability to stop anything. They merely just checked things that were done after the fact. And the quantity of the amount of money, $800 billion, was far larger than 5 people could actually oversee and control. Now we're talking about $4.25 trillion. And that same committee is going to be overseeing almost something is the same oversight committee that was done for the last TARP loan, which the last TARP loan was about $800 billion. Last TARP amount was an $800 billion stimulus. And that committee never had the ability to stop anything. They merely just checked things that were done after the fact. And the quantity of the amount of money, $800 billion, was far larger than 5 people could actually oversee and control. Now we're talking about $4.25 trillion. And that same committee is going to be overseeing almost something that's larger. So we already know that oversight's not going to work. The Democrats know and the Republicans know. And it's literally there as a salve for the Democrats to say they did something. They did something as effective as the last thing. And what Dilligan Radigan's pointing out here is that this is going to lead to an even greater concentration of wealth, bigger than the last round of 10 years. And I want to say something about Boeing. Boeing was offered a $17 billion bailout. But when Boeing was asked, the Boeing CEO was asked, well, what if that $17 billion was tied to the government taking equity and ownership of the business? That is, some sort of nationalization. They said, never mind, we don't need it. So they don't need the money. They're going to use this money to basically do whatever they want, as long as they can make control over it. So people should have no illusions that the only people who are screaming for this money are small businesses and workers. The big capitalists are fine, and they're going to get stronger out of this, stronger to buy up assets internally, but also stronger to buy up assets externally. This is also about imperialism. This is about the U.S. competing with China, U.S. competing with Europe, because there was a I'll get a little bit into this, but prior to the coronavirus, there was an economic downturn that was starting.
Yeah.
And Goldman Sachs didn't see it because Goldman Sachs predicted that in January that the economy was going to boom. But this is where I want to mention this dude, David Dodwell, who is an executive director of a Hong Kong APEC trade policy for the United States, and is part of a think tank there. And he wrote this article in November of 2019, titled, and he wrote it in the South China Morning Post. It says, the world economy is headed for a recession, and China won't be there to save it. And he wrote this: a decade after the global financial crisis, with the world's leading economies still addicted to the near zero interest rates of the emergency response of quantitative easing, it seems the global economy remains on life support, with our experts still flummoxed about how to restore economic health. Trade across the world is stalling. Most leading economies are reporting near zero economic growth. Investment is in decline. Government and corporate debt sits at record levels, with most central banks warning political leaders the monetary armory is empty. They are calling for a fiscal stimulus like building infrastructure and cutting taxes, when most governments are staring at a deep budget deficits and under pressure to cut rather than increase spending. In short, our economic leaders are so gloomy about growth prospects for the next 3 decades, they are unwilling to borrow money even when the borrowing is virtually free. I am sure many of you are feeling I am being unreasonably gloomy, but the data available to us points with terrible consistency in the direction of a recession. So the coronavirus is not the source of this thing. The coronavirus is the catalyst for it. The source of this collapse is really what is very common and I'll read something else later. It was a crisis of overproduction. All the different economies, Europe, United States, and China, were all producing much more than could be consumed by it, and China was actually starting to become the economy which is slowing it down by not. And this was even before coronavirus in Wuhan, that was not consuming up cars, was not consuming up products, and at every level you were seeing a growth in production in this last year. And I'll show a graph later on that shows that. But so this one thing was coming. But what I look at it like is almost like, in the context of the coronavirus, what looks to me like a controlled demolition of the economy, of the global economy. They knew it was coming down, but how do they control it, and how do they make sure the wealthiest get off the best?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this money, right, that is being dumped on financial institutions, it's not going to be accessed by us, and or the people that pay rent. We're going to be indebted while these guys borrow big money at little to no interest to buy, again, the things that make this economy, the economy's heartbeat. Like land, like the means of production and fundamental things. So again, this after every crisis, or at least the recent crisis, the richer get richer, and that gap, that divide becomes even bigger.
And it's interesting that $500 billion are going to be granted over to big corporations with no strings attached. But there's a $357 billion loan program for small businesses. If this capitalist country wants to really shore up, supposedly, the small businesses, as it claims to do, as the Republicans and the Democrats always say, that this is a country where you can thrive, you can have the American dream, you can, build big business, and you can build, a small business here, family owns business. It's not possible because the corporation, it's a monopoly, and the Democrats and the Republicans don't really, they voted, like I said, to zero on giving the big corporations a huge chunk with no strings attached, and this loan program to the small businesses, which they have to pay eventually.
Yeah.
So
And
I heard this term just quickly. This term is trickle down economics on steroids. Like that's basically whether I don't know if they fundamentally believe that works, but their idea, I guess, is to shore up the job creators, I guess, in some way. I mean, sarcastic,
Yeah.
But
yeah,
and what's happening with the small business, is first. Let's be clear that 500 billion is really a stand-in for 4.25 trillion slush fund for big corporations. Basically, anybody who has over 500 employees can get access to that. If you have under 500 employees, then you're subject to the small business one. Overseeing the small business one is not Mnuchin, who is going to be and this oversight committee, which will have no strings attached, but is the Small Business Administration, which is supposedly be a heavily bureaucratized, very slow. It's one of the worst institutions in the U.S. government, supposedly. But furthermore, they're actually putting restrictions on small business that they're not putting on big business. Small business cannot lay off any employees. Big business can. Big business is in fact slightly incentivized for laying off employees because the government has promised in these next 3 months to come in and shore up their earnings with the extended unemployment. Okay, so think of the unemployment insurance as actually another bailout for the big capitalists, because now they can lay off workers and say you can just go on government unemployment for about 3 or 4 months, and the government will essentially pay your salary.
I mean, we know who dictates the rules. It's not the small businesses. They're not dictating the terms of the game. I mean, there's even like a different, basically, tax system for small businesses and big business. Because I work in a small business, very mom and pop, maybe 15 employees, 20 maybe, and it's incredible. I see the numbers, and trying to make a profit is just incredibly hard. No one's getting rich in that, maybe we'll talk about Marx, but, he said that, the small and medium business, or capitalists, they're closer to us and they're, the proletariat, than they're closer, than the capitalists, because they're closer to the institution every day, and this is proven, that in this city, San Francisco, the very least a third of restaurants are going to close and not reopen. That's going to change the city drastically. Many cities in this nation,
and then get bought up by big business, and then figure out how they're going to restructure that city when buying up all these businesses.
So that was already happening in this city. In terms of restaurants, to start a business, restaurant, a liquor license is $200,000 to $300,000. So the new businesses, you needed big money, millions of dollars to start. So you were already behind. As a person who was in the industry and aimed to open a restaurant or a bar, you needed big money behind you, and now even more. And you have the political class, like Gavin Newsom, who owns a bunch of restaurants, and his family. And they dictate the terms of the game. We don't. While we struggle to survive small business. So I don't know, just this little anecdote.
So I just this was something I found from Lenin, writing about this stuff about the relationship between small capitalists and big capitalists in the context of crisis. He wrote this: the lessons of the crisis, which has exposed the absurdity of subordinating social production to private property, are so instructive that even the bourgeois press is now demanding stricter supervision over the banks. Now he's talking about 1911 right now, but it's true today. But no supervision will prevent the capitalists from setting up enterprises in times of boom, which must inevitably become bankrupt later on. But what does the crash of enterprises mean in capitalist society, he asks. It means that the smaller capitalists of second magnitude, are eliminated by the big billionaires. The place of the millionaire is taken up by the Moscow billionaire, who, being a richer capitalist, will bring greater pressure to bear on workers, the supplanting of small capitalists by the bigger capitalists, the increased power of capital, ruination of masses of small property owners, the frightful impoverishment of the workers, all this is brought about by the crisis. And this is over 100 years ago.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
things have not changed fundamentally in capital.
that's the thing. Yeah, you said that. That I agree with that. Fundamentally, it's the same game. Even the way Amazon operates, the way they operate, the way they've gotten so big is by squeezing, creating chaos. On small business, making them go bankrupt or close to, and then buying them up. And this is essentially what I see is happening now, just in mass. And so it's a free for all for the people that have access to capital, or cheap capital. And in great quantities, because I as a working class person and in a household of 4 working adults that earn a decent living, we cannot afford a house in San Francisco, and this puts us even further behind because now we're barely working, but guess what? Who's going to buy the houses?
Yeah.
And just to say, and this is my feeling about it, is this process of monopoly capital development like this. It's a function of the way capitalism operates. But politically, what's happening is not just a function of greed of rich people being connected to the state. This is actually the U.S. state preparing its capitalist class for warfare with the other capitalists, for economic and political warfare, by allowing them to massive amounts of distressed capital as possible under the context of a global crisis, so they can be in a position to procure resources here and buy up resources there. So this is not just internal repression and internal inequality growing, but it's also part of the aspect of imperialism, of how all these different capitals essentially go to war with each other over who can strengthen their capitalist class the most in order to buy up those and get those resources around the globe.
I wanted to say something about your video about Elizabeth Warren
Yeah.
and Bernie Sanders. And it was just that I think they know this, especially Elizabeth Warren, who fought viciously during the 2008 recession, and she called out the big banks who were too big to fail. And I think that she would know that there is this undercover way of being able to deliver to the wealthiest class here during this disaster, taking advantage of the crisis to put more money in their pockets and to continue allowing them to get away with it, to gamble with our taxpayer money. And so I just am disheartened personally, because I know that both of you don't vote for folks, but I have said in the last episode that we talked about Bernie Sanders that I did vote for Bernie Sanders, and I'm not voting for a Democrat this November, but I did vote for, and I would have had it been Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. Those two were only the people that I would have been, all right, here's my vote, or a tally in California. But it is a blow to progressives, like I think on this person that you had mentioned on the video, who I think was a Bernie Sanders supporter, right?
Yeah, to Jimmy Dore. Yeah, he is, and maybe I think he's shifting now, but we'll see.
I mean, I don't want to go into what is a Bernie Sanders supporter. I don't think I'm a pro-Bernie Sanders supporter, as I once was. I think I simply, I think of it differently from you two, that I do think that there could be a lesser degree, just this lesser two evils thing, or just Bernie Sanders, that we're not going to get into right now, because Kenny has to get going at 6:30.
No, don't. We're going to get into it.
Don't lose that.
So the point is, though, that they know that the Senate, because it was a 99% vote, right?
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the onset of this episode. So I'm simply saying that everyone is in on it.
I mean, and it's really crumbs. I think you wanted to talk about the portion that is going to the workers, or Gibson?
I want to stay with the political aspect of Sanders and AOC. They are not. You are completely right, Eduardo. They are in on it. And their role was to obscure the robbery of corporations, to direct us to these crumbs that were being sent to workers. There was, Kenny?
No, the one thing, the way I started to think about this is like, the way I talk about it is regardless of their intentions, say, okay, they're well-meaning. Regardless of their intentions, their actual function is to obscure. Their actual function is to hurt us back to the Democratic Party, and this is what we get, and then we get Joe Biden, shoved that down their throats, and now we have to pick party politics. So again, regardless of their intention, and I mean, this is more evidence that they're in it. I mean, the fact that they're just putting their head down and following, their ruling class, really.
Yeah, and I want to go farther than that. They know their function because the steps to stop this were right ahead of them. There was only one politician who tried to get in the way of this thing. That was Thomas Massey, a Republican, a ultra-conservative Republican. Here's a tweet he said about the stimulus and how he tried to stop, and I'll tell you about how he tried to stop it and how AOC could have worked with him to actually bring a halt to this. He said, "The stimulus package that just passed is the biggest wealth transfer from common folks to the super rich, Wall Street and bankers, in the history of mankind, done in the name of a virus with $1,200 checks as the cheese in the trap." And he says this will be obvious in short order. I don't agree with him. I actually think that this is going to be obscured for quite some time by the left. But here's what he did. He basically, on the floor of the House, Sanders had already given the pass to this thing and already said this is great for workers. Oh, there's some problems, but it's great for workers. It wasn't. This is devastating to workers. This is going to crush things for us in the future as capital masses into bigger capital sections, and they bring ruin to workers who are left after the recovery of the economic after the next economic recovery from this crisis. But AOC, with the way he was going to stop this thing, was basically saying, I'm not going to just let you do a voice vote on this thing. I'm going to call you all in, and you all have to come here, and you're going to do a roll call vote. Every person's going to have to register their vote here. And they said, oh, we can't do that at coronavirus. And he said, BS. You got to come here, and you got to say it. And I'm not going to go forward until we do that. He needed one more person from the House to be with him so they could hold that vote up and actually force people to do that. AOC didn't want to touch it. Rashid Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, all of them, actually on the floor, on the floor, they all said, "Oh, this is awful, this is awful." But then at the same time said, "Now you're forcing our hand," and they ended up voting for it. So these people are charlatans. I've said that word over and over again. These are not people who don't know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. They know their role, and they are playing it. Their role there is to basically tranquilize the working class into accepting the rule of the rich, and they're doing a brilliant job of it. I'm not going to give them the pass for whatever their role is. It's there.
So much for socialists, AOC and Bernie Sanders.
No, I mean
the democratic socialists, and not socialists like you two identify as. Right?
And it's
still capitalists.
It's a betrayal that is so clear, but it's actually the one thing that this Massey guy said is that people are going to figure it out. That part I actually don't necessarily agree with. We actually see how the capitalists were able to go from one boondoggle hidden by Obama, the last TARP agreement in 2008, and now they're onto a new one that's kind of hidden under the pandemic, hidden under the coronavirus, because people are talking about hospitals and stimulus packages and $1,200. But I agree with him when he says that's just the trap in the cheese in the trap.
I actually wonder. I don't recall the speed which they moved in 2008, because it makes me wonder and question whether there was already plans for this shit. Because we know that in capitalism it's a matter of time for another crisis. Even capitalists know this. Even Wall Street investors, they know crises are a thing of capitalism. And it's just a matter of time of where was the next one. We knew a year ago. We started to see some signals in the economy. I have friends in the banking industry, and they know that the housing market was like slowing down to a halt in San Francisco, one of the hottest markets in the world. The long-term investments were taking over the short-term because they weren't hopeful that that the economy was on good footing. So my question is, I wonder if you have any thoughts of whether they had plans for this already. to some degree, because they move pretty fast.
Yeah. I will say two things. One is various senators had plans, like had these 1,000-page document plans, and you found the same language in some of those plans, which indicated that these were things that have been sitting some places that they included in all their plans, because different senators had different plans, but all had some of the same kind of language because they were all just taking shit off the shelf for like digital economy stuff and things like that. So that's one thing I know. But I will say that one person pointed out that essentially what took 6 months to do under TARP in 2008 took 2 weeks to do here. And so, and this is part of what is called modern monetary theory that was kind of tested out in 2008, where you literally just print money or just create money as a way of stimulating your economy. That is going to create a problem, but the theory is it doesn't. The theory of the economists are you can print as much money as you want as long as you keep that money moving. All right, so it's not just about how much you print, but how much motion in the money, which is why the last thing you want, because they printed up so much money last time and they're printing up even more now, not printing dollars, but moving decimal points somewhere on a computer, basically, is the thing they are most terrified about is the economy slowing down to a halt, where then it unleashes all these problems that are building and building and building. And that's why they keep essentially doubling down, printing more money, more fake money to keep Wall Street moving, so things don't slow down. Because if things slow down, the people who practice this modern monetary theory, then they think some of all these practices they've been doing are going to be visited on us in terms of massive inflation and things like that.
As a matter of fact, part of the argument that Democrats were making with the Republicans was that even if you do bail out these companies, even if you do have this payment loan program for the small businesses, part of the capitalist economy is to be spending. You have to spend. That's just how this works. So that's why the roots of the problem they were arguing wasn't so much just also bailing out, was also, if people are staying at home, trapped indoors during this quarantine, and they're not really spending at restaurants, or they're not really spending at their local bar, then the economy is halted no matter how much you are trying to bail out the private sector. Mm-hmm. So, that's why, if we can segue, that's why they began this they began creating this stimulus package, included handing out to individuals cash, regular people like you and I, to regular people, we'll discuss in a second what that means. So I know all the three of us have some differences about what that means, because not everyone is going to equally be able to get some of this cash. Right. But they were going to get out of this $2 trillion stimulus package some money to be able to be spending during this time.
Yeah, and just to say that, and this is kind of an important point, I think, that the political impetus for the part of the stimulus that went down to people was not a result of suffering, was not a result of struggle. That was something Wall Street was asking for and begging for, because they were concerned about exactly what you're talking about. It's like, look, we need gas in the engine, so please put some money down there. And so it's important that Wall Street and the capitalists have been running this entire game.
And I just real quick a thought that there are two things that have been tools in the past two big crises, 2001, that created an economic crisis, 2008, are coming together in this plan now, because Bush was the first one to send checks basically to.
That's right. I remember.
And in order to stimulate the economy, he even spoke of go spend. Spend. Yeah. And I guess that this is the idea behind this. But at the same time, I see it more on these others. When you mentioned this, and this being cheese in the mousetrap. Because $1,200 for what we think it's coming, for workers, the most vulnerable workers, that's not enough. And also this is not about need, right? This is just about throwing money around, because not everyone needs $1,200. There's people that are still working and still, working remotely, and they don't need the $1,200. Well, other people might need $2,400. So it's not about, again, caring for people. It is, to me, it's a sleight of hand. It's to be able to do this trick here so they can do this massive thing on the side. And because there's so many people concerned, and so yeah, they are focused on their $1,200. But we completely overlook the massive infusion of money into the financial institutions, which are one of the pillars of our capitalist world. And I think that's where power lies, really. Because even like Boeing, they need financial institutions and to do their bidding.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very interesting because we haven't talked about healthcare. We haven't talked about people dying or people going to hospitals. And there are some hospitals that are feeling a crunch, right? In New York, in LA, I'd heard that are kind of overwhelmed with not enough beds and things like that. But one of the things that really indicates that even the hospital stuff that they set up in that bill is it just seems fake to me. Is there's not a single dollar for testing. And in any country that's been able to deal anything with this COVID thing, it's been about a pretty massive testing regime, so you can isolate the people who actually have the thing. The fact that they put no money in for testing, which would actually deal with the spread, is a fairly significant piece of dealing with the spread of a virus that you say you're afraid of. How can there be no money for that? And it's to me that's fairly damning to say that what's driving this is very little to do with trying to deal with the healthcare aspects of this. That's why I do feel like they knew the economy was coming to a crash. Yes, this pandemic catalyzed it, but now it's about controlling the process and making sure the wealth goes in the right place in the context of the panic.
My mother, when they brought up the $1,200, her immediate response is like, dumbasses, they should be mailing out test kits, not checks, to people. It's like, yeah, there's little care. We can maybe segue into that, because even the amount of money that is in this, bailout, that the money dedicated to the medical side of things, it's minuscule, in comparison to the rest. I see countries in Central America, like in their response, and they obviously have a lot less resources. And sure, they might be performing for the camera, but the fact is that they're trying to pass out masks for people out on the streets and masks. And where is my fucking mask? We have a shortage of masks here. Where is my test? I'm still waiting for my test. So we're all wondering and scared, whether shitless, as to what's next, and we are hopeless. There's very little we can do but wait. In hope that they, trickle down some shit that will save our ass. And so we're starting a new month right now, and and we just gotta tread water.
There's $150 billion to hospitals who are treating coronavirus patients, so that's part of the stimulus package. It's not enough.
Right.
It's not, in this country, it's just not going to be able to, this is now the epicenter globally of where the entire there's not where it started, but where it's been even worse than other countries. Yeah. And if this so-called rich country is not able to still handle this pandemic, then surely, as you're pointing out, Kenny, poorer countries will not be able to. Countries that have been disenfranchised by the wealthier countries.
Yeah, and Kenny, go ahead.
So I'm just saying that actually, I think they might be they're having a better response. They're taking a wartime approach in some places, and yes,
specifically about Latin America, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about Central America.
Countries in Africa are not doing well.
Well, no, I'm talking about Central America. I'm not talking every country. Central America, particularly. Like for example, one of the responses in El Salvador was to freeze payments on electricity, water, basically rent, and a lot of things like that. Frozen for a few months. I think no one makes a payment on that shit. Because they understand the depth of this problem to a degree. Obviously, they also have their own corrupt, goals. But in terms of the care for life, there's a lot of disregard for life in this country. If I say I take the capitalist competitive, mindset right now, and this is shameful. This is shameful. We're projecting 100 to 200,000 people dying in the richest nation in the world.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll see what ends up happening, but no doubt that there are people who are dying who wouldn't necessarily need to die, and one of the biggest reasons is supposedly the overwhelming of certain hospitals with people who've got respiratory issues. And why would you not, like China built hospitals in relationship to this? So why would you not do that? Why would you not at least set up field hospitals? And secondly, Italy had to do this, and Italy got a bunch of respirators from China. Now the U.S. is not going to do that because they're using this to declare war on China. So they're not going to be getting respirators from there, even if they could get those respirators to help save lives, because the bigger issue is an economic and ultimately a political and military war with China, which is being established right now with the new Cold War. In fact, Trump did that whole act, which basically said we can begin to direct our companies to make respirators and things like that. But they're already there. They're already in China. They can pull them from there. And they won't do that because of the political aspect of seeing China as the enemy is much more important right now than saving lives.
I think for me, I'm just seeing, just when you talked about El Salvador, Kenya, I was thinking about what's happening in Panama with now a cultural shift. There are certain days of the week where men can go out to go do shopping and women can do shopping separately. There's dividing genders. And the men are, sorry, I'm digressing here. It's just the men are sort of there's videos of them just sort of looking over their shopping list, trying to identify some of the things on their list. Not to say that all men don't know how to
That was me at Berkeley Bowl on 2 days ago. It took me an hour and a half to do something I think Randy could have done in 30 minutes.
Even socialists have blind spots. So
anyhow, I remembered this Panama because you mentioned Central America, and so I listened something called the Global News BBC News podcast, and it sort of talks about different ways that different countries are dealing with this pandemic. So I remembered this tidbit from Panama.
I was going to kind of end on maybe two things. First, Marx. I want to do a quote from Marx. It's a very famous quote Marx makes about capitalism, because a lot of people think of this as like, who could have predicted this coronavirus? Absolutely, it wasn't predictable, and the things that's happening are surprising. But Marx understood capitalism differently and said that capitalism itself was unpredictable for the capitalists. And here's how he described it. He goes, "Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells." And he went on for there. In these crises, when he was talking about crisis, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction, where you can't sell your stuff. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seemed to be destroyed. And why? Because there was too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces of at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered, and so soon they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole bourgeois society and endanger the existence of bourgeois property. And he goes on to say that, basically how in recovering from that, they basically create new conditions. The only way they can recover from these crises is creating conditions that mean the next crisis have to be worse. And that, I think, is what we're seeing. This has not been a pandemic of course the pandemic has been unleashed on, but really what Marx is describing is capitalism is like a force of nature unleashed upon all of us that only a few benefit from, but cannot control it. They're like he describes the capitalists as like a sorcerer that conjures this thing up, but ultimately they can't control it. But to the extent that we don't stop them, we end up paying the price.
Yeah, I mean, I always think like, so on Instagram I tend to blurt out my thoughts, and one of the things I was thinking about is that the next crisis is being prepared right now, you know, and you know, we haven't even gotten out of this, and we don't even know, you know, how we're being set up, and they themselves don't know, but something else will be coming, you know, and that something else might be war,
right?
You know,
yeah,
no,
and, yeah, and Trotsky also talked about how crisis was a part of capitalism, boom and bust, breathing in and breathing out. But he said that each crisis was going to get worse and worse and worse, and that's what we're seeing. Like we have 6.6 million people already filed for unemployment in 2 weeks. That is more people filing for unemployment in 2 weeks than did in 6 months during the Great Depression. And people are predicting 30% unemployment, you know, out of this. And this clear that this crisis is going to be worse than the last one for us, and that's why I do believe that yes, there are going to be a recovery out of this, a recovery that's going to really suck for us as capital accumulates into these large capitals again, and that they restructure business so that basically they're as lean as possible and efficient as possible, which is going to be bad on workers. But the next go around, these crises are going to get worse, and this is why I do believe the groundwork is being laid for the kinds of economic crises that are going to result in war and world war. And that's what I see the groundwork being laid for, particularly as countries separate into these national capitals and defend their borders, not just against immigrants, but against products.
Yeah, because right now a lot of basically global capitalism is going to enter in some sort of crisis, and so they're going to depend even more on the domestic markets. China has a big, middle class now, and they don't have to necessarily go abroad. We've had, it is evidence in things like recycling, right? Like the things that the ships that we used to get product from China, they would return to China with recycling, and China said, no, we have our own, our own recycling, so we no longer need your stuff, and so. Yeah, I don't know. This is a new era of globalization, kind of undoing itself.
New, but the same.
Yeah.
Because I want to end with this quote by Trotsky, because I pulled this stuff out. I told Kenny that I found quotes by Lenin and Marx and Trotsky, and he's talking about the boom and bust cycle. And he writes this: the fact that capitalism continues to oscillate cyclically after a crisis merely signifies that capitalism is not yet dead, and that we are not dealing with a corpse. So long as capitalism is not overthrown by the proletarian revolution, it will continue to live in cycles, swinging up and down. Crises and booms were inherent in capitalism at its very birth. They will accompany it to its grave. And that grave either ends in the common ruin of all of us or in socialist revolution. And there is no choice. And when I say socialist revolution, that's not Bernie Sanders, that's not AOC, that is working class democracy, that is the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is something that is closer to what is being organized by a small subset of Amazon workers right now in relationship to this, and that strike leader was basically fired for disobeying COVID-19 laws of quarantine, right? That's why they did it, right? They ended up firing him using quarantine laws to say we're going to get rid of your job, not to just union bust. But nevertheless, there will be more of that. But it is those sorts of actions that we're seeing from those Amazon workers, the kinds of actions that we saw by the yellow vests. That is the only way to take care of to solve this issue. It has nothing to do with anything we're going to find in Washington from Sanders, AOC, from any of them.
And I would add personally to achieve the final goal of getting profit out of the equation, and because otherwise we're talking about reformism,
yep.
And staying within capitalism and the means of exchange in capitalism has a life of its own, like Marx was saying in your quote. And sometimes people think that when we talk about capitalism, maybe we're talking about, or they have this visual because of movies of some heads in a room, planning and plotting. That's not how it works. The the thing, the incentive is profit. That is what drives every fucking company.
Yeah.
And it gets in the way of providing and sustaining life. And even now as we're quarantined, it is kind of evidence, I think, that most work is unessential. And so we are very capable of producing things for sustaining life, and so we can explore other things and be human, and have time to be human and exist. And so I don't know. That's just a little bit of my hopeful and idealist.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know I've been monopolizing this episode a lot, but I will just say, if you are in quarantine, go ahead and watch the news. Go ahead and look at YouTube videos. I do it. But one thing you must do during quarantine is read the Communist Manifesto. Do that and see if what you see in there describes what's happening right now. He wrote that in 1860 or something like that. But it does a very good job describing the forces that are being unleashed today.
Yeah.
Start there and then start reading some Lenin.
Yeah, I agree. Second that.
And I encourage people to also look at some of the ways in which the capitalists and governments are taking advantage of this pandemic, such as we're seeing examples in Israel, where now laws are changing so that people can be monitored, so that people can be delayed a vote. I'm curious to see if this administration, no matter if it was Democrat or Republican, would change their voting dates to stay longer in power, changing the way that this country is going to be run. Russia is changing as well. Putin is excusing reasons for to stay longer in power. I mean, there's just examples everywhere around the globe where people are using this pandemic for their benefit to stay in power longer, to be able to, or as we have pointed out, to use this funneling of money going to a certain corporate establishment. So it's exploitation and using lots of excuses. I think that this is what you had talked about in your last episode. In the last episode about the shock doctrine. You didn't say the shock doctrine,
Yeah.
but pointing out the shock doctrine, where people do take advantage of a certain crisis to make it their own.
Yeah, and one other thing, this is just an additional thing I found out that's in the stimulus package. $700 million is paying for the continued development of technologies that allow companies to monitor people's contacts so that they can control the spread of the coronavirus. Something that was started in Israel, right? Where they basically, you find your, so they're putting $700 million to helping develop that.
It's already in use in China.
Yes.
There are people who have these apps basically where in order to go into a building, they have to show a code, because it tracks where they've been for the last 18 days.
Fooling people into believing that this is for your safety, and really it's just going to be more of a way to cause mass surveillance.
Yeah. And I feel like the code word for all this is going to be called the new normal.
Just as our phones being tracked, and Alexa. Do any of you use Alexa?
We do.
I hope not, Andy.
Alexa heard this entire conversation, I guarantee you. Watch yourself.
All right. Anything else? I wanted to end this episode being grateful to the team of people that are in our life that make this podcast / channel available possible, especially during this quarantine. So I just wanted to end by saying that I'm grateful for you two as co-hosts, and I will mention other folks as well, like Alex and Shirley, who have made their space available as a low-tech studio. Not during this time, but normally every week they put up with us to be there.
Yeah.
And for example, Brandy, who constantly has to hear you out, but you'll give your appreciation to her. I'm just saying. But I'm really grateful to both of you, Alex and Shirley, And that's what I just wanted to point out during this time. If you two want to say something about that, because they're really anyone that you think that makes this podcast/channel possible, please say so.
I'm definitely grateful for both y'all, and I definitely appreciate, Eduardo, the chance you took in starting this channel, about almost 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years ago, starting May 2018. So I appreciate the degree to which you've stuck with it this long, and it's done me a lot of good. And I'm really glad to have Kenny on board. You mentioned, Brandy has been a huge support for this. It's like sometimes we can't really talk about politics successfully, she and I, but she watches these episodes and she's like, okay, I can view this from a safe distance. So I really appreciate that. And but she has been a big supporter of this, and of course, my comrade Brian Belknap. We talk a lot about these issues. We've spent the last decade and a half being revolutionary socialists, trying to figure out what the hell's going on in the world, and I really appreciate that he's continued to stay with me through this, and he helps me kind of assess some of the things we're all saying here, and that makes it means a lot to me for making these episodes matter.
I also want to thank both of you for inviting me to be part of this show. I mean, you did it for a year without me, and obviously you're still going strong, and just, happy that you find my opinions valuable. And, just also Brian, thank you. Lipson, you've both been very helpful in being patient and helping me think through stuff without telling me, just letting me figure out my stuff. My mother, my brother, they always listen to my crazy stuff, and similar, to you and Brandy, Lipson, sometimes we talk about politics, but they still listen and they support me, and him, I think all of us, him has always been a sounding board as well, and she doesn't, she's like a rock. She doesn't sway too much one or the other way. And so she's kind of kept me grounded many times with my ideas, because she doesn't buy into the hype, very quick. And so, but yeah, thank you again.
That does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information. I want to really stress that so folks can really find us. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog at what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes of this podcast / channel there and connect with us. And you can find us on any of our 5 platforms. Please rate, review, subscribe on iTunes Podcast, Bitchute, Google Play, YouTube, and Stitcher. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, please connect with us on our blog. Alright. So that does it for this episode, and we'll catch our audience next time.
All right.
Ciao.
See y'all later.